The city breathed in two very different rhythms. Up on the cliffs, where the air smelled of salt and expensive flowers, the Sterling mansion stood like a silent guardian. Inside, a girl sat perfectly still at a grand piano. Her name was Elena. The evening sun cut through the wall of windows, turning the polished floor into a sheet of gold. Her fingers, poised above the keys, were steady. She began to play a piece by Chopin. Every note was correct. Every pause was exactly as written in the heavy book before her. The music filled the vast room, but it sounded like it belonged to the piano, not to her. A woman watched from the doorway. Vivian Sterling. Her posture was as straight as the marble columns in the hall. She listened, her face a mask of polite attention. When the last note faded, she gave a single slow nod. "Technically flawless, Elena," she said. Her voice was cool, like the breeze from the sea. "But remember, it's not just notes. It's a story. You must feel it." Elena let her hands fall into her lap. "Yes, Mother," she said softly. She did feel something. She felt the weight of the massive chandelier above her. She felt the eyes of the portrait of her grandfather, a famous composer, watching from the wall. She felt the pressure of the charity gala next week, where she would perform this piece for 200 important people. What she didn't feel was the story Chopin was trying to tell. Later, in her room that was more like a museum, Elena scrolled through her phone. Her life was a stream of perfect pictures. The conservatory, the gallery openings, the quiet dinners with her mother. It was all so quiet. She stopped on a video a friend had sent. It was filmed in a noisy, low-lit bar downtown. A girl was at an old piano, her head bowed, her whole body moving with the music. It wasn't Chopin. It was something raw and bluesy, full of mistakes that sounded right. The girl played like she was pouring something out of her very soul. A strange ache settled in Elena's chest. She closed the app. That was a different world. That different world was a 40-minute drive away, in an apartment above a bustling bakery. The air here smelled of warm bread and coffee. Music here wasn't for galleries. It was for living. A girl named Chloe was humming as she wiped down the small kitchen table. Her mother, Maria, was stirring a big pot of stew, her face glowing from the steam. "Long day, sweetheart?" Maria asked. Her voice warmed. Chloe smiled, leaning against the counter. "Just the usual." The coffee shop was crazy, and the library was quiet. Perfect balance. She didn't mention her feet hurt, or that a customer had been rude. She just focused on the good smell of home. After dinner, while Maria dozed in her favorite chair with a book, Chloe went to the corner of their living room. There sat her piano. It wasn't a Sterling grand. It was an old upright, its wood scarred, a few keys chipped. She had found it at a thrift store 5 years ago, and Maria had worked extra shifts to buy it for her. To Chloe, it was more beautiful than any jewel. She didn't open a book of sheet music. She just let her fingers find the keys. She started with the simple, melancholic lullaby her mother had always hummed to her, a tune that felt like safety and love. Then, slowly, she let it change. It grew legs, walking into a sad, rainy day blues, then twisted into something faster, something that fought back. She played the stress of the rude customer, the joy of the warm bread, the deep, steady love for her sleeping mother. The music was a conversation with her own heart. Miles away, in a tidy little house with a well-kept garden, an old woman named Agnes was also watching the same video of Chloe. It had popped up on her social media. Agnes was a retired nurse. She loved these little videos of everyday people making beauty. But as she watched Chloe's hands fly over the keys, something else caught her eye. Not the music, but the girl's face. The intensity in her eyes, the specific curve of her smile. It tugged at a very old, dusty memory. Agnes got up slowly and went to a wooden chest. She pulled out an album from over 2 decades ago. There were pictures of her younger self in a nurse's uniform at St. Agnes Hospital. The night it happened was legendary in the hospital's history. A small fire in the kitchen had triggered a full, chaotic evacuation of the maternity ward. New mothers in gowns, babies in bassinets, everything in organized panic. Agnes remembered her specific task: getting 2 newborns to safety. One, a girl born to the elegant and terrified Vivian Sterling, was wrapped in a beautiful, custom-made cashmere blanket. The other, a girl born to the exhausted but radiant Maria, was swaddled in a soft, handmade cotton blanket. In the smoky hallway, with lights flickering and voices shouting, a frantic intern had taken the babies from her for a moment. When they were handed back, Agnes had been so focused on getting them outside, she hadn't thought to check. Later, in the calm, she'd felt a flicker of doubt. The blankets felt off, but the tags on their ankles seemed correct. She had shaken the feeling away. Chaos played tricks on the mind. Now, looking from the faded photo of 2 tiny blanket-swaddled babies to the vibrant playing girl on her screen, the feeling roared back. It wasn't just the face. It was a ghost of a resemblance to a young Vivian Sterling from the society pages Agnes sometimes saw, and the other girl, the one in all the charity event photos. Elena Sterling. She had the same gentle shape to her eyes as Maria in the old hospital records. A cold certainty settled in Agnes's stomach. She had dismissed her doubt for over 20 years. She had told herself it was nothing. But seeing Chloe's passionate, unpolished talent, so unlike the sterile performances of Elena she'd seen online, the pieces clicked into a terrible, perfect picture. The right baby had gone home with the wrong mother. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just a memory. This was 2 lives. She couldn't stay silent, but she was afraid. The Sterlings had power, money, lawyers. And what about the other mother? The one with the kind eyes? Would she be hurt? Destroyed? Agnes closed the album. She sat in the quiet of her living room for a long time, the weight of the past heavy on her shoulders. Finally, she walked to her small desk. She would not call. That was too frightening. She picked up a pen and a plain sheet of paper. She would write 2 letters. Simple, anonymous, just enough to plant the seed. She would tell them to check, to really look. It was the only thing she could do. As she began to write, the only sound was the scratch of the pen, a sound as quiet as a secret and as loud as a coming storm. The letter for Vivian Sterling arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in a plain white envelope with no return address. It sat on a silver tray with the rest of the day's mail, looking utterly out of place among the thick, cream-colored invitations and embossed charity requests. Vivian, sipping her morning tea, almost dismissed it as junk. But something made her pick it up. The message inside was typed. Brief and felt like a physical blow. Asterisk to Mrs. Sterling. Asterisk, asterisk, I was a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital the night your daughter was born, during the fire evacuation. I have carried a doubt for many years about the identity of the infants. I believe there may have been a switch. The child you raised may not be your biological daughter. I am so very sorry. I suggest a private DNA test. Check the ankle tags from that night, if you still have them. Asterisk, asterisk, a voice from the past. Asterisk, Vivian's hand went perfectly still. The elegant script of her name seemed to blur. The sounds of the house, the distant hum of the dishwasher, the click of the gardener's shears outside faded into a dull roar. She read it again, and again. Each time the words "may not be your biological daughter" cut deeper. Her first reaction was cold, furious denial. This was nonsense. A cruel scam. Someone trying to upset her, to extort money. Elena was her daughter. She had the sterling bearing, the sharp mind for business, her father's smile. Didn't she? But as the initial shock cooled, a darker, quieter truth surfaced. It was a truth she had spent 22 years ignoring. The disconnect. From the moment they'd placed the baby in her arms, wrapped in that soft cashmere blanket, Vivian had waited for a wave of overwhelming feeling. It never came. She had loved Elena, of course, provided for her, shaped her, but it had always felt like a project, a duty to be performed perfectly. She'd blamed herself a cold woman, unfit for motherhood. She'd blamed Elena, a quiet, watchful child who never truly seemed to need her. What if the reason was far simpler and far more terrible? That evening, watching Elena practice the same chopin piece, Vivian studied her. She looked for herself, for her late husband. The shape of the eyes? The curve of the ear? It was all suddenly unfamiliar. The doubt, once planted, grew wild and thick. She couldn't ask. She couldn't breathe a word of this madness. Acting on an impulse that felt both shameful and necessary, she waited until Elena had gone to bed. She went to the grand piano, where Elena's half-full water glass sat on a coaster. With a hand that trembled slightly, Vivian took the glass, careful not to smudge the clear prints. She wrapped it in a clean cloth, her heart pounding a guilty rhythm in her chest. The next morning, she personally delivered it to a discreet, expensive private lab down in the city. Maria found her letter 2 days later, buried under a pile of bills. Her heart sank at the sight of the plain envelope. More bad news, she was sure. She opened it while standing at the kitchen counter. Still in her waitress uniform, the message was similar, but the words hit differently. Asterisk, to the mother of the girl who plays piano with so much soul. Asterisk, asterisk, I was at St. Agnes Hospital the night your daughter was born. During the fire scare, there was confusion. I have never forgotten the faces of 2 babies, or the doubt I felt later. The child you love may not be the one you gave birth to. I am so sorry for this pain. A mother knows her child. Look in your heart. Asterisk, Maria didn't read it twice. She let the paper fall from her fingers as if it had burned her. A wild, protective laugh burst from her throat. What garbage, she said to the empty room. This was some sick joke, some fishing attempt. Chloe was her daughter. Every single cell in her body knew it. She had felt her kick inside her, had heard her first cry, had nursed her through every fever and heartbreak. The idea was not just wrong. It was an insult to the very core of their life together. She tore the letter into tiny pieces and threw them in the trash, shaking her head. But that night, as she lay awake, the old, sleeping guilt she had carried for 2 decades quietly woke up. She remembered the chaos of that night. The alarms, the shouts of evacuate, the scary smell of smoke. A young nurse had handed her a baby, wrapped snugly. Maria, exhausted and scared, had held the bundle close. In the bright lights of the parking lot, as she looked down at the tiny, perfect face, a fleeting thought had crossed her mind. The blanket feels different. The one she'd packed was a simple cotton thing her own mother had made. This blanket was softer, finer. But in her overwhelmed state, she'd reasoned she was mistaken. The hospital must have switched it. The baby, her baby, was safe in her arms. She had buried that doubt so deep, she'd almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Now it was back. She turned to look at the wall that separated her room from Chloe's. She could almost hear the ghost of a lullaby. Her lullaby, the one she'd made up and hummed every night. Chloe knew it. Chloe was hers. The letter was wrong, but what if it wasn't? The thought was a bolt of lightning in the dark. If it wasn't wrong, then her real biological daughter was out there somewhere. A stranger. The thought made her physically ill. And Chloe, her Chloe, would she be taken away? Would she have to go live with some rich family? The panic was immediate and suffocating. No, this secret had to stay buried. For Chloe's sake. For their family's sake. She would never, ever speak of it. A week later, a man in a sober suit appeared at the door of the apartment above the bakery. He held a professional-looking folder and offered a polite, impersonal smile. Maria's blood ran cold. "Miss Bennett, my name is from Sterling Family Advisory. We represent the Sterling family. We'd like to speak with you on a confidential matter. May we come in?" Inside, the man was gentle but direct. He explained that Vivian Sterling had reason to believe there was a question about her daughter's parentage connected to the events at St. Agnes Hospital. A private investigation had led them to Maria. He slid a photograph across the small kitchen table. It was a recent, glossy picture of Elena Sterling at a charity event. Maria stared at it. The girl was beautiful, poised, and utterly foreign. But around the eyes, there was a softness, a shape she saw every morning in her own mirror. Her hand flew to her mouth. "We have a DNA test result here," the man said quietly, opening the folder. He pointed to a line of complex numbers and a simple, devastating conclusion. "It confirms that Elena Sterling is not the biological child of Vivian Sterling. Our records indicate you gave birth at the same hospital at the same time. We have reason to believe the children were accidentally switched." The room spun. The smell of yesterday's baking seemed to turn sour. All of Maria's resolve, her denial, crumbled to dust under the weight of the official document. This was real. "What does she want?" Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "Mrs. Sterling would like to meet." "To understand." "To see your daughter, Chloe." The word "your daughter" hung in the air. Which daughter did he mean? The one in the photograph, or the one practicing scales in the next room? Maria felt the foundation of her life crack straight down the middle. She looked toward the living room, where her Chloe, her heart, sat completely unaware, her music floating through the thin walls. The melody was their lullaby. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the fine lines on her cheek. The past had finally found them. There was no hiding now. "All right," she said, the word barely a sound. "We'll meet." The meeting was arranged at the lawyer's office. A neutral place, they said. Nothing about it felt neutral. The room was too quiet, too cold, filled with the scent of lemon polish and old paper. Maria sat stiffly in a leather chair, her hand tightly clutching Chloe's. Chloe, for once, was silent. She wore her best dress, a simple blue thing, and felt like an impostor. Across the wide, polished table, Vivian Sterling sat alone. She looked like a statue carved from ice, elegant in a gray suit, her hands folded neatly. But her eyes, averted to the window, gave her away. They were red-rimmed and lost. Elena was the last to arrive. She slipped into the room, her movements graceful but automatic, like a wind-up doll. She didn't look at anyone. She took the seat beside Vivian, leaving a careful space between them. The two girls, for a fleeting second, glanced at each other. It wasn't curiosity. It was the wary look of two people who had just realized they were standing on broken glass, and the other person might be the cause. The lawyer, a woman with a kind but weary face, began. She spoke in soft, clear sentences about hospital records, fire drill protocols, and statistical probabilities. She laid out the DNA test results with clinical precision. 2 sheets of paper were placed side by side. One proved Vivian was not Elena's mother. The other proved, with a match of over 99.9%, that Vivian was Chloe's biological mother. Maria was Elena's. The facts hung in the air, heavy and final. No one moved. The hum of the air conditioner was the loudest sound in the room. Maria was the first to break. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ugly. She turned and pulled Chloe into a fierce, crushing hug. "You're my baby," she choked into her hair. "You're my girl. That paper doesn't change that." "It doesn't." Chloe hugged her back, but her eyes were wide open, staring over her mother's shoulder at the elegant woman across the table. Asterisk, that woman is my mother? The thought was impossible. Biology was a concept from a school book, not this cold room. Her mother was the one holding her, smelling of bakery sugar and lavender soap. Vivian finally spoke. Her voice was a dry whisper. "Elena," she began, but stopped. She looked at the girl she had raised, searching for something familiar and finding only a stranger in her daughter's clothes. I don't know what to say." Elena didn't look at her. She stared at Maria, at the woman whose genetic material she shared. She saw her own nose, the same slope of the forehead. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror, a version of herself she never knew existed, shaped by a different life. A hot wave of nausea hit her. "So," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady and cold, "I'm nobody. I'm not a Sterling. I'm just a mistake from a hospital mix-up." "Don't you say that." Maria's voice was sharp with pain. "You're not a mistake. None of this is your fault. You hear me?" Her anger wasn't directed at Elena, but at the universe. But the damage was done. Elena had built her entire identity on being Elena Sterling. Heiress, pianist, legacy. Now, with a few words, the foundation was gone. She was a placeholder, an accidental guest in a house that was never hers. Vivian flinched at Elena's words. "This is my fault," she said, not to Elena, but to the room. "I should have felt it. I should have known." For the first time, her perfect composure cracked. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through her powder. She quickly brushed it away. The lawyer suggested a period of adjustment. Careful, supervised meetings. Perhaps a therapist for everyone. It all sounded like a plan for managing a disaster, not a family. Invitation was extended. A terrible, polite invitation. Vivian, her voice stiff, asked if Maria and Chloe would come to the Sterling Manor the following weekend. To talk more, in a less formal setting. What she really meant, but couldn't say, was, asterisk, I need to see her. I need to see if I feel anything. Asterisk, Maria, holding Chloe's hand like a lifeline, nodded numbly. She felt she had no right to refuse. The drive back to the apartment was silent. Chloe watched the city blur past the window, the cliffs and mansions giving way to crowded streets. Her world had been flipped inside out. The girl in the quiet car beside her mother felt like a ghost. Up in the manor, Elena went straight to her room, the room that wasn't hers. She looked at everything, the imported furniture, the shelf of trophies from competitions she never loved, the expensive clothes in the closet. It all felt like a costume. Who was she supposed to be now? The poor girl from the bakery? She didn't know how to be that person. She didn't know how to talk to the woman who had given birth to her. She felt a sudden sharp hatred for Chloe, who seemed to have stolen nothing, yet had taken everything. The weekend arrived like a storm. Maria and Chloe stood at the enormous oak door of the Sterling mansion, feeling small. A housekeeper let them in. The sheer scale of the entry hall made Chloe dizzy. It was so quiet. Their footsteps on the marble floor echoed like gunshots. Vivian greeted them in the sunroom. She had arranged tea on a silver tray. Tiny sandwiches, scones, delicate pastries. It was all so correct, and so utterly wrong. The conversation was agony. "Do you enjoy school, Chloe?" Vivian asked, pouring tea with a hand that shook slightly. "It's okay," Chloe mumbled, staring at her lap. She didn't mention she was studying business management at the community college, hoping to help her mother run the bakery better one day. It felt stupid here. "Elena attends the conservatory," Vivian said, then immediately looked pained, as if she'd made a comparison Maria tried. Elena, your mother, Vivian, told us you play beautifully. She stumbled over the names, the relationships a tangled knot. Elena, sitting rigidly on the edge of a chaise lounge, gave a tight smile. Thank you. It's expected. The silence that followed was suffocating. They toured the grounds. Vivian pointed out gardens, a tennis court, a view of the ocean. Maria made polite noises. Chloe trailed behind, her eyes taking in the impossible green of the lawn, the utter emptiness of it all. She missed the sound of traffic, the smell of the bakery, the clutter of home. She missed her mom's real laugh, not this tight, nervous sound she was making now. Elena watched them. She watched Vivian's eyes flicker to Chloe again and again, a desperate, searching look on her face. She watched Maria look at her with a painful mixture of guilt and curiosity. She felt like an intruder, a ghost in the narrative of her own life. At one point, Vivian gently touched Chloe's arm to guide her toward a rose garden. Chloe instinctively pulled away, just a little, before forcing a smile. The hurt in Vivian's eyes was immediate and deep. Maria saw it too, and her own face filled with a complicated sorrow. Elena saw it all. That small flinch was a confirmation. Chloe belonged here. This life, this woman, was her birthright. And she, Elena, was just in the way. The bitterness in her mouth tasted like metal. The beautiful house, the perfect gardens, the silent tea, it was all a prison she was about to be evicted from, and she had no idea where to go next. The girl from the bakery had a home, a mother who fiercely loved her. What did she have? A name that was now a lie, and a cold, empty room at the top of the stairs. The air in the sunroom had grown too thick to breathe. The polite questions had dried up, leaving only the heavy silence and the clink of fine china being set down too carefully. Chloe couldn't stand it any more. The walls, lined with books no one seemed to read, felt like they were closing in. May I use the restroom? She asked, her voice small. Vivian looked almost relieved at the break in the tension. Of course. Down the hall, past the staircase, third door on the left. Chloe escaped into the cool, dim hallway. She didn't need the bathroom. She just needed to move, to be away from the painful, watchful eyes. She wandered, her soft-soled shoes silent on the polished wood. Portraits of severe-looking people followed her with their painted gazes. She turned a corner and found herself in a different part of the house. A pair of tall, carved doors stood slightly ajar. From within came a soft, diffused light. Pushed by a curiosity stronger than her unease, she nudged one open. The room was like something from a dream. The afternoon sun streamed through a high, arched window, catching dust motes that danced in the air. And in the center of the room, on a deep, richly colored rug, sat a piano. But not just any piano. This was an instrument of dark, glowing wood, its surface a mirror, its shape a graceful curve of promise. A concert grand, Chloe's breath caught. Her feet carried her forward without permission. She'd never seen anything so beautiful, so silently powerful. It made the community center's upright look like a tired old toy. Back in the sunroom, the silence stretched. Elena studied the pattern on the rug. Vivian traced the rim of her teacup. Maria searched for something, anything to say. The distant, tentative sound of a single piano note echoed faintly down the hall. Everyone froze. It was a clear, resonant note, holding in the air for a moment before fading. Then another, and another. Not a song yet, just an exploration. The touch was hesitant, gentle. Vivian's head tilted. Elena? She asked softly. Elena shook her head, confused. I'm right here. The notes from the other room grew a little more confident. They began to connect, forming a simple, wandering scale. Then they settled into a pattern. A melody emerged. It was slow, achingly familiar, and filled with a lonely kind of sweetness. Elena went very, very still. Her eyes widened. Her hand, resting on her knee, clenched into a fist. She knew that tune. It lived in the back of her mind, a ghost that visited in quiet moments. She had never played it for anyone. She had never even written it down. It was her secret melody, the one she called her ghost song. Vivian was staring at the doorway, her face pale. She stood up slowly, the movement stiff. "That's—" she whispered, but didn't finish. She walked out of the sunroom, drawn by the music like a sleepwalker. Maria and Elena followed, a strange dread pulling them along. They stood in the doorway of the music room, unseen. Chloe was lost in her own world. Her eyes were closed. Her shoulders swayed slightly. Her fingers, which moments before had been tentative, now moved with a gentle certainty over the magnificent keys. She was no longer playing random notes. She was pouring out the lullaby. The simple, haunting, five-note motif repeated, then curled into a sad, beautiful variation. It was the same melody, but it was fuller, richer, lived in. It sounded like home. Elena felt the world drop out from under her. Her secret wasn't a secret. It was a shared ghost. It belonged to this stranger, this girl from the bakery, who was playing it with a feeling Elena could never quite capture. A violent mix of emotions stormed inside her, betrayal, wonder, and a deep, unsettling connection that scared her more than anything. Vivian took a step into the room. "Chloe," she said, and her voice cracked. The music stopped abruptly. Chloe's eyes flew open, her hands snapping back into her lap as if burned. She looked like a child caught doing something forbidden. "I'm sorry. It was so beautiful. I just wanted to—" Vivian wasn't listening to the apology. Her gaze was fixed on Chloe, but her question was for Maria. Her voice was thin, strained with an emotion too big to name. Where did she learn that? Maria was crying. Silent tears streamed down her face as she listened to the last echoes of the song. She looked from Vivian's shattered expression to Chloe's frightened one. "She didn't learn it," Maria said, the words thick with tears. "It's her lullaby. I made it up. When she was a baby, she'd only fall asleep if I hummed it. I've hummed it every night of her life until she left for college. It was ours." She looked at Elena, her eyes begging for understanding. No one else knew it. No one. The truth, which had been clinical and cold in the lawyer's office, landed in that room with the weight of a physical thing. A DNA test was numbers on a page. A switched blanket was a detail in a story. But this was a piece of a soul passed from a mother to her infant in the dark, quiet hours. A melody born in a small, warm apartment had somehow lived for 22 years in the mind of a girl in a mansion. It was impossible. And yet, it was the only thing that made perfect sense. Chloe looked down at the piano keys, her mind reeling. It's just the song from home," she whispered, confused by the intense reaction. Elena finally found her voice. It came out hollow. "I hear it. In my head. All the time. I always have." She looked at Chloe, the resentment in her eyes now mixed with awe. "I never told anyone. I thought it was just me." The two girls locked eyes across the expanse of the piano. In that moment, they weren't rich girl and poor girl. They were two halves of the same broken song. The music had bridged the gap of miles and money and upbringing, revealing a connection that was deeper than name, deeper than legacy. Vivian brought a trembling hand to her mouth. The clinical proof had been one thing, but this was her song, the one she had vaguely remembered humming in a fog of postpartum grief, a tune she thought she'd imagined and then forgotten. To hear it now, whole and alive from the fingers of this young woman, it bypassed her intellect and went straight to a primal, aching place inside her. This was her daughter. Not on paper. In her bones. She took another step toward the piano. Toward Chloe, not as Vivian Sterling, society matron, but as a woman whose lost child had just called out to her in the only language that mattered. "Could you?" Vivian asked, her voice barely a whisper, soaked with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Could you play it again?" Chloe, her own eyes glistening, looked at her mother and Maria. Maria, her face a map of love and loss, gave a small, tearful nod. "It's okay." Chloe turned back to the keys. She took a deep, shaky breath, and she began again. This time, the notes were not tentative or explorative. They were a story. The story of a mother's love, a child's comfort, a secret that had waited 2 decades to be heard. As the familiar, haunting melody filled the grand room, Vivian sank slowly into a chair nearby, her elegant composure gone. She just listened and wept. Elena remained standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, listening to the ghost in her head finally sing out loud from someone else's hands. And Maria watched her Chloe her heart. Her baby play the song of their life for the woman who had given her birth, and knew that nothing would ever be simple again, but that some truths, once heard, could never be unheard. The final note of the lullaby hung in the music room, not as an ending, but as a question. In the silence that followed, something had shifted. The hard, polished edges of the truth had been softened by the music. It was no longer just a brutal fact. It was a shared wound, a mysterious connection they all now carried. The following weeks were not a magical blending. There was no simple swap, no happy ever after where everyone traded places and called it a day. Instead, they entered a slow, awkward, and often painful dance of figuring out what came next. Vivian started by doing something she should have done long ago. She talked to Elena, really talked. Not about music theory or social obligations, but about the past. She apologized, her voice rough with regret. "I thought my distance was because of me," she admitted, sitting with Elena in the sunroom one gray afternoon. "I thought I was a cold person. I never let myself consider that. Maybe we were strangers trying to force a connection that wasn't there. That's my failure, not yours." Elena, who had been steeling herself for blame, felt the anger inside her deflate, leaving behind a hollow sadness. "Who am I supposed to be now?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since the lawyer's office finally spoken aloud. "You," Vivian said with more certainty than she felt. "You get to decide that. This house, the money, it's yours. You grew up here. It's your home, if you want it to be." The words were an offering and a release. Meanwhile, Maria faced her own fears. She sat Chloe down at their kitchen table, the familiar chip in the wood a comfort. "I'm terrified," Maria confessed, holding her daughter's hands. "Terrified she'll want to take you away, that you'll like that life better." Chloe shook her head, tears in her eyes. "Mom, that's not a life. It's a museum. You're my home. This is my home." But she was quiet for a moment. "But she's sad. And she's my mother too, in this weird way. I don't know what to do with that." It was Maria who found a fierce, unexpected kindness for Elena. She started by sending a text. Just as simple. "I made too much stew. Would you like some?" It was a lifeline thrown from one world to another. Elena, sitting alone in the vast, silent kitchen of the manor, stared at the message. She typed and deleted several replies before settling on, "Yes, please." She drove down to the city, her fancy car feeling conspicuous on the busy street. The warmth and noise of the apartment upstairs was a shock to her system. Maria didn't fuss. She just placed a bowl of stew in front of her, the same as Chloe's. "Eat," she said, as if Elena were just another one of Chloe's friends. No pressure, no painful scrutiny. Just food. Elena took a bite, and the simple, hearty flavor was like nothing she'd ever tasted. It tasted like care. She didn't cry, but something tight in her chest loosened, just a little. The bridge between the two girls was, unsurprisingly, the piano. Chloe, curious about the conservatory Elena attended, asked her about a tricky piece she was struggling with. Elena, grateful for a subject she understood, explained the theory behind it. In return, Chloe, listening to Elena practice one afternoon, finally said softly, "You know, it's okay to be messy with it." "It's not a test." Elena, frustrated, had snapped. "How? How do you just feel it?" Chloe thought about it. "You think about what you're playing about. This part," she pointed to a stormy section of the music, "isn't just loud. It's scared. It's angry. You have to play the fear, not just the notes." It was the first real advice about music that had ever made sense to Elena. Tentatively, they began to meet, just the two of them, in the Manners music room. Elena would deconstruct a sonata, showing Chloe the architecture of the music. Chloe would then take those bones and breathe life into them, showing Elena how to make it speak. They weren't friends, not yet. They were more like reluctant colleagues, bound together by a shared catastrophe and a shared language. Vivian began visiting the apartment, too. She came without fanfare, often bringing something impractical, but beautiful, an exotic fruit, a single orchid. She learned to sit on the worn couch and just listen. She heard stories of Chloe's childhood, of school plays and failed cakes, and the day they bought the old piano. Each story was a treasure to her, a piece of the life she'd missed. She never tried to be Mom. She was just Vivian, a woman trying to catch up. A year drifted by. Seasons changed. The sharp edges of the crisis wore down into a new, complicated normal. The idea for the recital came from Maria. The community center where Chloe used to play was having a fundraiser. "You two should play something," she said one evening, looking at both Elena and Chloe. "For the center. It needs a new roof." The girls looked at each other. The idea was terrifying. Playing alone was one thing. Playing together was a statement. They agreed to try. They chose not to perform a famous duet, but to create something of their own. They started with the core of it all, a 5-note lullaby motif. Elena built a structure around it, a delicate classical framework with variations. Chloe then wove through that structure, adding bluesy chords, unexpected rhythms, moments of silence that felt louder than sound. It was a conversation. Elena's disciplined, beautiful lines would speak, and Chloe's raw, emotional phrases would answer. They argued over sections. They laughed when something finally clicked. Slowly, the piece became theirs. The night of the recital, the community center was packed. The air smelled of coffee and old books. Vivian sat in the front row beside Maria, both women holding hands tightly, nervously. When Elena and Chloe walked onto the small, humble stage, they didn't look like a rich girl and a poor girl. They looked like two young women, one in a simple black dress, the other in a green skirt and blouse. They sat side by side at the old, scarred upright piano, the same one Chloe had learned on. They shared a look, a silent breath, and began. The opening notes were the lullaby, pure and simple, played in a gentle unison. Then, like two paths diverging from the same source, their parts separated. Elena's melody climbed, clear and precise, a thread of silver. Chloe's harmony moved underneath, deep and warm, a river of earth. And music swelled and fought and reconciled. You could hear the storm of discovery, the loneliness of the grand house, The warmth of the bakery kitchen, the confusion, the anger, and finally, a hard-won, fragile peace. They didn't play as swapped children or rivals or victims. They played as collaborators, artists who had taken the broken pieces of their story and built something new from them. As the last resonant chord faded into a perfect, stunned silence, the girl's hands stilled on the keys. For a second, there was nothing. Then the room erupted. The applause was not the polite clapping of a society gala, but a loud, warm, embracing wave of sound. Elena looked at Chloe and saw not a thief, but a counterpart. Chloe looked at Elena and saw not a princess, but a partner. They hadn't found a perfect family. They had found something else, a truth, however messy, and a way to move forward within it. They stood and took a bow together. In the front row, Vivian and Maria were both crying, their arms linked, united in pride for both of their daughters. The girls stepped off the stage, not to return to their old lives, but to walk into the crowded, noisy, imperfect room of their new one, a world that was no longer just rich or poor, lost or found, but simply, finally, their own.